that things have so deteriorated in the United States, we have no positive policies any longer. Just try to stop other things. The United States is decaying in many ways. Things are falling apart. It's part of we can go back to the reasons, but it's part of the neoliberal programs that go back to Reagan, which are designed specifically to concentrate wealth in a very small number of hands and to let the rest of the society collapse. And of course, in the military dimension, the United States is completely in a sphere of its own. But apart from that, it's an internally collapsing country.
네, 이쯤 되면 더 이상 설명할 이유가 없는 글로벌 머니톡입니다. 지난 시간까지는 전 세계의 현명한 구루들을 찾아가서 인터뷰를 한다는 둥, 그들의 지혜를 어쩌고 한다는 둥 다양한 말씀을 드렸습니다만 이제는 그런 수식어조차 필요 없는 명실상부한 동아시아 최고의 인터뷰 프로그램으로 저희가 굳이 설명하지 않아도 그렇게 이미 떠올라버린 글로벌 머니톡입니다. 자, 오늘 그냥 긴 설명 없이 바로 시작할 거고요. 이 글로벌 머니톡을 같이 해주시면서 사실상 거의 혼자 인터뷰를 하다시피 하고 계시는 중앙일보의 강남규 선임기자를 소개합니다. 참고로 이분은 여기 놓여 있는 이 책의 저자이기도 합니다. 어서 오십시오.
안녕하세요, 강남규입니다.
네.
참 쑥스럽긴 하네요. 사실은 늘 그 기사를 쓰면서 그 기사가 이제 순간순간 독자들한테 평가를 받는데
네.
면전에다 제 책을 냈습니다라고 말하는 것 자체가
제가 보기에 이 책은 좀 더 사람들에게 널리 알려질 필요가 있는데 출판사가 여러분들이 한 권 한 권 사실 때마다 한 권 한 권 찍어내는 거라면 여러분께 사라 마라 말을 안 하겠는데요. 제가 보기에 지금 여러분들이 한 몇백 권 정도만 더 사주시면 출판사가 2쇄, 3쇄, 4쇄 이렇게 쇄를 더 한 쇄 찍게 됩니다. 여러분이 한 권 사시면 앞으로 거의 수천 명에게 더 이 책이 나눠서 읽혀질 수 있는 좋은 책 한 권을 여러분의 서재에 꽂아 두시기를 바라겠습니다. 자, 그러면 또 오늘도 저희는 또 인터뷰를 하러 모였으니까 인터뷰를 해야 될 텐데 오늘 인터뷰를 저희가 할 분은 노엄 촘스키.
예. 미국의 여러분들 두 번 설명하면 아마 입이 아플 정도입니다. 미국의 비판적 지식인이고요.
예.
그다음에 그러면서도 현대 언어학의 어떤 혁명적인 변화를 이끌었던 변형 생성 문법 분야 이른바 이제 지금 현재 언어학의 주류죠.
예, 그러나 우리는 그의 언어학 이론에 대해서 큰 관심이 있는 건 아니고.
그렇지만 그러면서도 언어학에서는 굉장히 석학이면서 동시에 행동하는 지식인이고,
예.
그리고 미국의 통념에 대해서 강력히 비판하고, 심지어 유태인인데도 이스라엘의 존재와 정책에 대해서 강력히 비판하는. 그러니까 비난이나 감정적인 비평이 아니고,
네.
이 비판을 제대로 할 수 있는 지식인. 그 지식인이 보는 우크라이나 전쟁 1년
를 어떻게 바라보고 있는가?
그렇죠.
알겠습니다. 우크라이나 전쟁에 대해서 노엄 촘스키는 어떻게 생각하고 있는지.
그렇죠. 미국의 또 다른 우리 촘스키 교수의 애리조나 대학교에 지금 현재 적을 두고 있지만 미국의 MIT 대학에서 아직도 적을 두고 있죠.
어디 교수님인지는 잘은 모르겠지만 그냥
그렇죠.
노엄 촘스키예요.
지금은
정말
지금은 어떤 뭐랄까 나이 90이 넘으셔서 상당히 이제 그럼에도 저는 이분의 총기를 느끼실 수 있을 것이라고 저는 믿습니다.
미국의 리영희.
그렇죠.
노엄 촘스키를 만나보겠습니다.
교수님 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 정말 감사합니다. 사실 오랜 기간 기회를 엿봤습니다. 그래서 특별히 우크라이나 전쟁이 1년을 막 지난 시점에 맞춰서 인터뷰를 요청했습니다. 지금 현재 우크라이나 전쟁 어떻게 보이시나요? 어떤 양상일까요, 교수님?
Start as things now stand, both sides are escalating. The United States has provided advanced tanks. It's pressured Germany to provide German tanks, Leopard tanks. It's planning. There is talk of F-16 aircraft going to Ukraine. Ukraine wants them. They're talking about it. It'll probably do it. Then come further steps towards escalating the war. Meanwhile, Ukraine is being devastated. The longer the war continues, the worse it'll be for Ukraine. The claim is we have to keep supporting Ukraine because it'll be in a better negotiating position. It's very unlikely. What's happening is Ukraine is losing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Ukraine, it's interesting that what the United States expected at first was that Russia would fight the kind of war that the United States carries out. When the United States carries out a war, say the invasion of Iraq, goes straight for the jugular, destroy everything right away, shock and awe, destroy transportation, communications, energy, anything that makes the country function. The Russians didn't do that. Life in Kiev is not pleasant, but it's going on normally. That wasn't true in Baghdad. It wasn't even true in Belgrade. Not when the U.S. goes to war. But now Russia is beginning to carry out U.S. style wartime activities. It's going after infrastructure, not in Western Ukraine, but in parts of Ukraine. Longer it continues, the more that'll go on. It'll escalate. Ukrainian economy has suffered very severely. It's not clear how much more it can take. So continue the war and escalate it. There's more and more destruction in Ukraine and effects around the world. Millions of people are facing starvation because of the partial closing off of the exports of grain and fertilizer from the Black Sea region. It's a major exporter. It's not cut totally, but it's curtailed. There is the constant and increasing threat of escalation to nuclear war. Probably the worst thing that's happened, which is not much talked about, is that the war has reversed, not just stopped, but reversed the small steps that were being taken to deal with the environmental crisis. Now it's reversed. New oil fields opening. The fossil fuel companies are delighted. They're making immense profits. They're planning to produce more fossil fuels for the next 30 or 40 years. That means we're done. We're finished. Human life is not going to survive that. We don't have much time to deal with the environmental crisis. We've wasted a lot of time. It's getting worse and worse. It's coming to the point where we may be reaching irreversible tipping points. And meanwhile, the fossil fuel companies are planning, with US government assistance, I should say, planning to expand fossil fuel production because of the new opportunities that are offered. This is, from the point of view of history, this is just unspeakable. Here we are racing to a precipice. We don't have much time. We know what can be done, must be done. We're doing the opposite.
우리는 많은 군사 밀떡들이 러시아가 전쟁 초기에 왜 저렇게 우리는 사실 전쟁의 패턴도 미국에 익숙해 있습니다. 근데 이제 러시아가 그 초창기에 전격전으로 벌이지 않고 그다음에 우크라이나의 인프라스트럭처를 완전히 부셔놓지 않고 그 전쟁을 하는 걸 모습을 보고 어떤 전쟁 수행 능력이 떨어지는 거 아닌가 그런 시각을 갖고 있었는데 우리 촘스키 교수께서는 그런 도로, 항만, 전기 시설 등을 그대로 놔둔 상태에서 공격을 해왔던 러시아가 지난해 말서부터 묘한 변화를 보인다. 미국식 전쟁을 수행하기 시작했다. 미국이 이라크를 쳐들어갔을 때에 이 헤드쿼터, 그러니까 이 뭐랄까 전쟁 지휘부서부터 시작해서 각종 도로 항만을 깡그리 부시는 전략을 했거든요.
예.
굳이 그게 이제 펜타곤의 논리는 뭐냐면은 민간인들의 피해를 최소화하고 적의 전쟁 수행 능력을 완벽하게 부셔놓은 그리고 나서 그러니까 공군력으로 이제 부셔놓고 나서 미사일과 공군력으로 부셔놓고 나서 지상군을 투입해야지
예.
인명 손실이 적기 때문이다라고 하는데 지금은 러시아도 우크라이나에서 그런 전쟁 패턴을 보이고 있다라고
네.
말씀하셨습니다. 교수님 제가 이제 좀 뭐 현상은 짚으셨으니까 그렇다라면은 뭐랄까 학자로서 학자의 눈에 비친 우크라이나 전쟁의 기원 어떻게 생각하시는지요? 기원은 무엇이라고 생각하시는지요?
With Bill Clinton, George Bush, President first Bush, had made unequivocal, unambiguous promises to Mikhail Gorbachev that if Gorbachev agreed to the unification of Germany within NATO, which is quite a concession considering the history, but if he agreed to that, Bush promised that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, meaning 1 inch to the east of Germany. Go as far as East Germany, no further. There's been a lot of deception about this, but the documents are present, available. You can read them at the National Security Archive, original documents on the internet. Unequivocal, unambiguous. Clinton tore it up, started a new Cold War. He did it, as he explained to his friend Boris Yeltsin. He did it for domestic political reasons, to try to gain the Polish vote, the vote of ethnic communities from Eastern Europe. He was a domestic politician. And he told Yeltsin, well, I'm sorry, but I have to do this. He started it. The second Bush pushed it much further. He went as far as inviting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. He was blocked by France and Germany at the time. And he was opposed by virtually the whole US diplomatic corps. Even hawks like his own defense secretary, Robert Gates, said this is reckless. It's going to cause a reaction. The current CIA director, who was U.S. ambassador to Russia, strongly opposed. But he went ahead. And after the uprising in 2014, the United States moved to essentially integrate Ukraine within the NATO military command. And that was again highly provocative.
지식인답게 상당히 오래전의 사건서부터 빌 클린턴 시대서부터 그러니까 지금 이제 우리가 아버지 조지 부시 대통령 있지 않습니까? 조지 W 부시 아들 대통령 말고 조지 부시 아버지 대통령이 그 통독을 인정을 하면서 이 통일된 독일이 나토에 남아 있는 것을 인정받는 대신에 러시아 쪽에 그때 당시에 옐친 대통령 러시아의 옐친 대통령에게 1인치도 그 동쪽으로 그 나토가 영역을 확대하지 않겠다고 약속을 했는데 이제 빌 클린턴 대통령이 이 미국 내에 살고 있는 동유럽계의 표를 의식해서 동유럽계의 표를 의식해서 폴란드와 기타 몇몇 나라들을 나토에 가입을 시켰거든요.
그게 러시아 입장에서는 신경 쓰였다는
신경 쓰였죠. 그때부터 이제 사실은 러시아 입장에서 봤을 때 미국이 약속을 저버린 그런 흔적으로 보인다는 거죠. 예.
네, 교수님, 그 지금 언급하신 2014년 혁명이라면 우리가 알고 있기로는 우크라이나가 내부에서 친러와 친유럽으로 나뉘어서 서로 대립했던 그 당시의 시위를 의미하는 것 같긴 한데 그 이후에는 그럼 어떤 일이 이어졌습니까?
After the uprising which overthrew the government, who basically in 2014, the United States moved to essentially integrate Ukraine more or less within the NATO-US military command, military maneuvers, interoperability of weapons, actually pretty much what the US is doing to Taiwan right now. It's very similar. It's highly provocative. And the Russians kept objecting. They said, well, we can accept the NATO moves to our borders in other countries, but not Ukraine. Ukraine is, if you take a look at a map and you look at history, it's obvious why. Heavy weapons facing Russia and Ukraine, say German tanks now, that awakens memories. There's an open plane straight to Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's happened a couple of times before in the last century. No Russian leader is going to tolerate this. Every American specialist understands that. And Biden actually increased it. He moved to offer Ukraine what he called an enhanced program for NATO membership. Right through the State Department conceded publicly that they would not take any Russian security concerns into consideration. It sort of set the stage for invasion. Again, that does not justify invasion. The invasion was, there were alternatives. If you look at the record, Emmanuel Macron, France, was, who's about the one serious statesman in the world these days. He was making extensive efforts to try to convince Putin not to carry out the invasion. We have the transcripts of their discussion. They were published in France, and they're available on the internet. Until a couple of days before the invasion, Macron was offering reasonable alternatives that would have met major Russian objectives. But Putin just disregarded it. In fact, with contempt. At the end, he said, I have to go ice skating. I don't have time to talk to you. And a couple of days later, invaded. It's also extremely stupid from Russia's point of view. The effect of the invasion, quite apart from what it's doing to Ukraine.
교수님, 그 2014년 시위 내지는 혁명, 봉기, 그 뜻밖의 별개의 파장을 낳았다라고 말씀하셨는데 그 의미가 좀 궁금합니다. 어떤 파장을 낳았길래 지금의 우크라이나 전쟁에까지 영향을 줬을까요?
If you take a look at the broader context, it's just a tremendous gift to the United States. Enormous gift. That's one reason why the United States isn't even talking about negotiations. They're gaining from it. In fact, the official U.S. policy is that the war has to continue to weaken Russia. And as many commentators have pointed out, the U.S. is really getting a bargain for a fraction, small fraction of the U.S. military budget. It's causing severe harm to its only military adversary in the world. That's a bargain. And beyond that, geopolitically, Putin has solved a problem that has persisted through the entire Cold War. You go back through the entire Cold War, back to the Second World War, there was a major question as to whether Europe would move on an independent path, become what was called a third force in international affairs, as it certainly could. It's a wealthy, advanced society, more advanced in many ways than the United States, could be, except militarily, could be an independent force. Charles de Gaulle called for an independent Europe. Willy Brandt, Germany moved for what was called Ostpolitik, moving toward the east. Europe is basically a German-based industrial system, and its natural trading partner is Russia. Russia is rich in resources that Europe doesn't have. Europe has advanced technology and industry, which Russia doesn't have. It's sometimes called a marriage made in heaven. It's a perfect relationship. And the whole German-based industrial system in Europe was based on it. Became a major issue when the Soviet Union collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev called for what he called a common European home, extending from Lisbon, the Atlantic, to Vladivostok. No military alliances, moving towards moderate social democracy. No victors, no defeated. He's driven Europe into Washington's pocket. The United States is delighted, of course. Now the NATO-based system, which is run by the United States, incorporates Europe to gift from Putin. In fact, the United States is so delighted by it that, as I'm sure you know, in the latest NATO summit, the U.S. basically expanded the North Atlantic to include the seas off Korea. The Indo-Pacific region is now part of the North Atlantic, if you hadn't noticed. This is the U.S. allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, were invited to the NATO summit for the first time. So now the United States can mobilize, it hopes, even the Pacific for its conflict with China, which it's building up. It's almost at war with China now, trying to. U.S. policies are mostly negative, have to stop things, doesn't have positive policies. So you have to stop Chinese development, which is going to very much harm South Korea. Samsung, for example, which is a major industry, chip industry, it's now under orders from the United States not to pursue the China market, which is its major market. Same with the Netherlands and Europe. Same with Japan. I don't know how long U.S. allies are going to tolerate this, but this is all part of the system that Putin handed to the United States on a silver platter, quite apart from what's happening in Ukraine. So that U.S. corporations are just making an enormous profit out of this. Fossil fuel companies, military industry, they're just booming. It's a bonanza for the United States on every respect.
사실 흥미로운 설명인데
네.
2차 세계대전은 미국이 패권 국가로 등장을 하지 않습니까? 사실은 미국은 마셜 플랜 등, 유럽은 마셜 플랜 등 미국의 지원에 의해 먹고 살아야 되는 일정한 시기가 있었기 때문에 미국의 그늘 안에 들어갔거든요.
네.
근데 유럽만의 독자성을 지니고 싶어 한 열망이 있었답니다. 대표적으로 그런 열망을 표현한 인물이 이제 프랑스의 드골 대통령 같은 경우. 나토에서 일부러 탈퇴도 하고 그랬지 않습니까? 근데 그것을 사실 또 미국은 용납을 안 해왔다. 근데 2014년에 우크라이나 사태의 계기로 이제 이 동쪽으로 계속 영향력을 확대하면서 그 바람에 어떤 유럽의 독자성은 사라지고 이제 우리 촘스키 교수의 말로는 유럽 전체가 미국의 호주머니에 들어갔다. 그런 식의 표현을 쓰네요.
그게 또 러시아의 위협이었던 얘기겠죠.
그렇죠. 그러면서 이제 사실은 그 이후에 뭐 한국에서도 이제 태평양에서도 그 다음에 인도양에서도 미국이 끊임없이 진영을 확대하고 자기 진영과 상대 진영을 가르는 그런 정책으로 이어졌다라고 얘기를 합니다.
예, 뭐 많은 분들이 이 우크라이나 전쟁이 언제쯤 끝날 것인가를 궁금해하고 있고, 저는 그 답을 얻기 위해서는 전쟁을 일으킨 러시아가 무엇을 궁극적으로 얻기를 원하고 있는가, 그걸 이해해야 그걸 궁극적으로 얻든 혹은 그걸 포기하든 결정을 하게 될 거라고 생각합니다. 교수님이 보시기에 푸틴이 원하는 건, 이 전쟁을 통해서 원하는 건 궁극적으로 어떤 거라고 생각하십니까?
There's a whole industry that's telling us what they think is in Putin's mind based on nothing. It's kind of like reading tea leaves. We know what the Russians have said. It's pretty definite, pretty clear. They want Ukraine to be neutralized, to have a status rather like Mexico, which can't join it. Mexico can't join a Chinese-run military alliance, obviously, or like Austria during the Second World War, during the Cold War. They want to be neutralized and demilitarized, which presumably means no heavy weapons aimed at Russia, right on Russia's border at the highly critical point. That's their official, and also some form of independence or autonomy, some degree, for the Donbass region, the mostly Russian-oriented region, and Crimea, taken Crimea, which is pretty much part of Russia for almost all its recent, for centuries, and is strong and has Russia's only warm water military bases, sea bases in Crimea and Sevastopol. So that's very important for Russia. So that's basically their war aims, as they state them. I mean, people have concocted all sorts of stories about Peter the Great planning to conquer Europe and various fantasies. It's kind of like the claims that China wants to conquer the world, build up wild stories about the adversary. That's old, goes way back. But as far as we understand, as far as any evidence is concerned, Russia's aims were neutralization of Ukraine, demilitarization, preservation of the rights of the Russian-oriented regions in Donbass. The details have changed over the years. Up until the invasion, Russia was supporting the Minsk agreements, which would have meant autonomy for Donbass within a federated Ukraine, something like Switzerland or Belgium, a federation. Now it goes beyond. They say they want Donbass to be incorporated in Russia, even some other regions along the sea which connect Crimea to Russia. If you look at the map, Putin has now called for them to be annexed into Russia. So predictably, as the war continues, both sides harden their policies. That's normal. Whether there's still options for negotiation and diplomacy, we really don't know. You can't know unless you try. If you refuse to try, of course, there's none. So we know that as late as last March, there were negotiations, serious negotiations. That's well documented from Ukrainian and US sources under Turkish auspices. The Prime Minister of Britain, then Boris Johnson, flew to Kiev and informed the Ukrainians that the US and Britain didn't want negotiations. He was followed by US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. We don't know the details, but he presumably gave his usual message, the one I mentioned, that the war has to continue to weaken Russia. Anyhow, the negotiations broke down. There's very little. The press doesn't cover this. The government's opposed to it, so the press ignores it. So we don't have a lot of information. But we know at least that much. Are there possibilities now? Could be. I mean, people who are interested in diplomacy have put forth ideas. You take a look at the current issue of Le Monde Diplomatique, for example. There's an article by two Finnish specialists in diplomacy, and they propose some steps that could be taken to lead to low-level accommodations, which could then expand into larger possibilities. Whether this is feasible or not, there's only one way to find out. Try. If you refuse to try, of course not. And in fact, if you look at the discourse in the United States, all about war, nothing about negotiations, diplomacy, virtually nothing. If you look at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, he's called for diplomacy. If you look at and in fact, the Pentagon is the dovish element in the American government. They're the ones who are trying to hold back the escalation. They understand what war is. You go to people in Congress, they say, I mean, they're so irresponsible, it's almost unbelievable. They say, well, maybe there'll be nuclear weapons, but who cares? They don't understand what a nuclear war is. I mean, it's amazing. The Pentagon understands. They don't want escalation.
정말 재미난 표현을 하셨는데 마치 미국의 코 밑에 있는 멕시코가 중국과 군사동맹국이 되지 않기를 미국이 바라는 것처럼 우크라이나도 그 나토의 일원이 되지 않기를 바라는 게 러시아 욕망이지 않겠는가, 푸틴의 욕망이지 않게 원하는 바이지 않겠는가. 사실 그거 이상으로 설명이 뭐 필요 있겠습니까, 사실 그렇죠.
러시아 입장에서만 본다면 그렇죠. 우리로 치면 이제 제주도가 중국령 되는 그런 느낌 뭐이었겠죠. 예.
교수님, 사실 제가 인터뷰를 준비하면서 과거에 이제 교수님께서 다른 매체와 인터뷰를 하시는 것을 몇 편을 봤습니다. 근데 우크라이나 전쟁이 자칫하면은 그 핵전쟁으로 비화할 수 있다, 핵전쟁으로 번질 수 있다라고 우려를 하셨는데 그 우려가 지금 현재 1년, 개전 1년이 막 넘은 시점에서도 그 우려가 가시지 않는지요?
It's a definite possibility. So far, it's easy to imagine steps that could lead to nuclear war. So, for example, the United States, just a couple of days ago, in fact, announced that the guiding of precision weapons has been by U.S. Military, which means they're directly, that when these advanced missile systems attack Russian forces, they're directed by Americans. The equipment, of course, is coming from the United States and its allies. So far, Russia hasn't responded, but they might. They might attack supply lines, for example. They haven't done that, even inside Ukraine. They might go on to attack supply lines in Poland. They might use more advanced weapons. As soon as you start with that, the chances for moving up the escalation ladder increase. And anyone who's ever studied war games or thought about these things knows that once you start with one foot on that ladder, it's easy to go up. One provocation leads to another, and so on. Pretty soon you're gone. And it seems that a lot of Congress and many commentators don't comprehend that there cannot be a nuclear war between major powers. I mean, we're all finished if that happens. I mean, the military analysts understand this very well. Take a look at the doomsday clock, famous doomsday clock. They just moved it to 90 seconds to midnight. They gave up on minutes during the Trump years. Now it's seconds, 90 seconds to termination of the species. It's not a joke.
여전히 그렇다고 하시네요. 사실은 그 최신 무기를 우크라이나에 미국이 지원하게 되면은 사실 첨단 무기를 운용하는 것도 상당한 훈련과 노하우가 필요하거든요.
무기만 조사할 수 있는 게 아니죠.
그렇죠. 마치 한국 전쟁 당시에 미그 15 전투기를 실제로 모은 사람은 그 옛 소련의 조종사들이었지만은 그들이 입었던 군복은 중국군이나 북한군일 때가 있었거든요.
예.
많았거든요. 마찬가지로 미국이 만약에 우크라이나의 첨단 무기를 지원할 때 각종 미사일 지원할 때 그걸 운용 인력을
예.
미국이 운영한다고 했을 때에 그렇다면 러시아는 러시아의 시각에서 본다면 이것은 미국이 직접적으로 전쟁에 개입한 거다라고 보고
그렇겠네요.
예. 폴란드나 그 이후에 이제 병참 기지라고 하는 보급로해상에 있는 후방이 있는 그런 데를 공격하게 되면은 이제 확전이 되면서 핵전쟁으로 번질 수 있다. 그런 가설입니다.
예.
네, 가설입니다. 가설이기 때문에 한번 우리 구독자분께서는 참고하시면
예.
되겠습니다. 지금 현재 미국이 러시아나 중국을 겨냥해서 뭐 반도체 동맹을 구성한다든지 다양한 그 연합전선을 형성하고 있습니다. 어떻습니까? 그 연합전선의 구성 이게 미국이 뜻대로 잘 이루어지고 있다고 판단하시는지요?
Well, what's happened as an effect of the Ukraine war and other developments in the world is that the United States is the major oil producer. But apart from the United States, the main fossil fuel production is in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They're beginning to move away from the United States for the first time. Saudi Arabia has been almost a colony of the United States since its origins in the 1930s. Now it's moving more independently. It's making arrangements with Russia, with China, even some with Iran, which is its major enemy. But it's moving toward the east. United Arab Emirates is already deeply embedded in the Chinese system. If you look at the Chinese expansion through Asia, the so-called Silk Roads, the maritime Silk Road goes right through the United Arab Emirates. In fact, that's one of the bases for it, entry into the Red Sea and off towards Europe. And this is beginning to undermine reliance on the dollar. These countries, including all the BRICS countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, are setting up their own arrangements for trade and commerce independent of the US-based dollar economy. They don't like the US sanctions are opposed by almost the entire world. Even Europe is opposed to the sanctions. It harms them. They go along because they're subordinate to the US. But if you look around the world, almost nobody obeys the US sanctions. They don't believe in them. They don't agree with them. They're setting up their own arrangements, trade in some of it's Chinese currency based, some of it's other arrangements, but the world is just drifting away from the US dollar-based economy. And the petrodollar is declining because as Saudi Arabia sees its future in arrangements with the East, with China, Russia, Iran, it's drifting away from US domination. And it's worth noticing that the United States has almost no positive policies, only negative policies. We have to stop others. That's US policy. Conflict with China, we don't have any. US has no programs. It has to stop Chinese programs. That's US policy. So we have to cut back China's technological development. We have to carry out, the official term is encircle China with a ring of sentinel states, including South Korea, Japan, Guam, Okinawa, Australia, armed with precision weapons, advanced precision weapons aimed at China. Meanwhile, major naval maneuvers, RIMPAC, so-called, in the Pacific, aimed at China, but crucially prevent China's technological development. The business press by now just calls that a war against China, try to prevent China from getting advanced semiconductors, chips, and so on. That's where South Korea fits in, because that means cutting back on Korean economic development as well. Germany is the one that's suffering the most, but it's also true for South Korea and Japan. Cutting off the China market would be very harmful to them. They're trying to find ways around it somehow. But the point is, going back, a lot of this is based on the threat that the United States poses with sanctions. And as long as the international financial system is located in New York and Washington, the threat of sanctions is very severe. You can be cut out of the international financial system. And that's for such the SWIFT systems are called. And so other countries are just finding a way around this. It was quite striking that the newly elected president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, was just in Washington a couple of days ago. And the big controversy he had was over arms to Ukraine. Said Brazil's not going to send arms to Ukraine. What that means is Brazil is joining almost the entire world. India isn't sending arms to Ukraine. Indonesia isn't. They don't want this. They see this as a proxy war between the United States and Russia fought with Ukrainian bodies. They don't want to have part of it. So Lula called for, he said, Brazil will move towards a negotiated, will try to be an intermediary to bring about a negotiated settlement, but we don't want to be part of the war. And that's the position of almost the entire world outside of the United States, Britain, and the Anglosphere, Europe, Australia.
네, 교수님 뭐 전반적으로 미국이 계획대로 잘 미국의 계획대로 일이 잘 되어가고 있는 것 같지는 않다는 요지로 들립니다. 근데 그렇게 보시는 게 혹시 교수님이 미국의 주도력 내지는 미국의 저력을 다소 과소평가해서 그런 것은 아닌가 하는 우려와 질문이 좀 드는데요. 세계는 점점 더 미국을 중심으로 뭉치고 있거나 하는 현상은 여전히 가속화되고 있지는 않습니까?
It's not just me, incidentally. This is a common analysis. If you take a look, just yesterday, Graham Fuller, whose career was in the CIA, he was one of the top intelligence officers in the United States for decades. It just came out with a discussion of current policy, basically like this. He said things have so deteriorated in the United States, we have no positive policies any longer. Just try to stop other things. I mean, the extent to which this is true is astonishing. So the United States, internally, the United States is decaying in many ways. The bridges are collapsing, the subways don't work, things are falling apart, needs infrastructure. Well, Congress wouldn't pass it. The Republicans are opposed. They finally agreed, but it had to be called a China competition bill. So if we want to build bridges in the United States, it has to be in the framework of competition with China. It's part of the, we can go back to the reasons, but it's part of the neoliberal programs that go back to Reagan, which are designed specifically to concentrate wealth in a very small number of hands and to let the rest of the society collapse. That's basically neoliberalism. And it's worked in a way. Just to give you an estimate, the Rand Corporation, which is a quasi-governmental corporation, very respectable, did a study on the transfer of wealth since Reagan, the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population to the top 1%, $50 trillion. That's not small. And it goes along with decline in benefits, decline in job security, large number, probably majority of the workforce just gets by from one paycheck to the next. The United States does not have the social services that exist elsewhere in the world. So there's no health security. Even simple things like maternity care for women after childbirth. Every country has it, not the United States. It's the only country that doesn't, outside of a couple of Pacific islands. The United States is the only major country, maybe the only country, in which mortality is actually increasing. That never happens, except in war, pestilence. But mortality is actually increasing among the white working class people in their working years, 25 to 60. It's just a collapse of the society. You see it in other things like the killings in the schools, and these are symptoms of a society that's collapsing from within. And the one strength that it has is military. So that's your strength, that's what you use. It's not competing with China in developing Eurasia through the Belt and Road system. There's no program like that. Just against, try to stop other things. It's a significant change in the last years. It's connected with internal changes. So there's been a shift in the United States from being an industrial power to being a financial power since the 1980s, basically. Production has stagnated or declined, and finance has just boomed. And finance doesn't produce anything; it just plays with money. You take a look at the biggest corporation in the world, Apple, $1 trillion corporation. When Steve Jobs, who founded it, was running it, it was aimed at developing good products. That's what he wanted. He's out. Current CEO, Tom Cook, what he wants is to devote resources to financial manipulations. You can make more profit that way. So you don't make better computers, you just play games on the market. Much more profitable. But it means it's one of the symptoms of the society declining. You can't have a functioning society based on people playing games on the stock market. The production is somewhere else, and all of that is happening at the same time. The United States is far and away the world dominant power, even economically. But so US-based multinationals control about half the world's wealth. That's nothing even close to that. And of course, in the military dimension, the United States is completely in a sphere of its own. But apart from that, it's an internally collapsing country.
자기 말고 여러 사람이 그런 시각으로 보고 있다. 그리고 이제 이미 여러 사람들이 보는 그 시각을 자기가 전했을 뿐이다는 요지로 말씀하셨는데, 근데 흥미로운 것은 미국이 어떤 자기들의 어떤 자신감을 잃어가는 현상이다. 그게. 그러니까 내부적으로 뭔가 쇠락하는 느낌, 그리고 어디서 활력을 잃어가는 느낌이 있기 때문에 국제적으로 그렇게 어떤 근육 자랑, 플렉스 머슬 하는 그러니까 힘 자랑을 하는 그런 태도를 보이고, 그다음에 그러다 보니까 과거의 60년대 미국이 보여줬던 어떤
진짜 파워가 아닌 게 나오는
자신감이 있으면은 어떤 네 편과 내 편을 가르는 게 아니고 뭔가 이제 어떤 명분을 가지고 그래서 그 중국이 1대1로를 하는데, 이 중국이 1대1로로 우리 시각에서는 많은 한국인들이 이제 중국의 팽창으로만 이해하지만 정작 1대1로 프로젝트 같은 어떤 형태의 건설적인 뭔가를 상대 국가에게 줄 수 있는 프로젝트가 미국은 이제 거의 없지 않느냐.
그러네요.
네, 그렇죠.
점점 더 실제로는 소리는 크게 나고 있는데,
그렇죠.
근육량은 소실되고 있는.
어찌 나를 두고 얘기하는 것 같습니다.
네, 사람으로 치면 한 50대 중반에 접어든 그 누가 봐도 파워가 강하지만
그저 웃지요.
예, 스스로는 거울 앞에 섰을 때 뭔가 자꾸 이제 눈물이 나기 시작하는 그런 나이에 미국이 접어들었다.
교수님 설명 잘 들었습니다. 근데 그 미국이 세계를 자기 편에 세워서 중국을 뭐 러시아를 지금 현재 이제 또 견제를 하고 있고 또 중국의 성장을 견제를 하고 있는데 어떨까요? 이게 성공할까요?
It's not going to be a success in the long run. If you look at this in broad geopolitical terms, you look at modern history, mostly Europe-based. Europe pretty much conquered the world, so it was centered in Europe. England was the dominant military and economic power, and British policy was to try to prevent continental Europe from being unified. So the great fear of British policymakers were that one country, maybe France in the 18th century, Germany later, one country would take over and unify Europe. British constantly tried to prevent that. It was an island off the coast of Europe. Well, that was pre-World War II. After World War II, that changed. The United States replaced Britain as the global power. Now, the Western Hemisphere, which is run by the United States, is an island off the coast of Eurasia. It's a kind of an expansion of the more local policy of Britain, Europe, when Britain was dominating the world. Well, we know where that led to. Now we have a greater version of that with the United States trying to run the world as an island off the coast of Eurasia. It's not going to work. That means holding on to Western Europe at one end, trying to hold on to Japan and South Korea at the other end. But they have their own interests and concerns. In fact, Japan is still working closely with Russia in oil development in Siberia and so on. The United States doesn't like that, but can't stop it. It's all of these things are happening in the world. The point is we do not have much time to waste. All of these powers must come together and accommodate to work on global problems which have to be solved or they'll all be destroyed. If we don't work together on the climate crisis, we're all finished. Either China, Russia, and the United States cooperate or they all are destroyed. There's no borders to these problems. Climate crisis has no borders. The nuclear war just destroys everything. Pandemics, this one's bad enough, but other ones are coming, and they could be much worse. We've been lucky so far. If you take a look at the viruses that have spread, there's some, like Ebola, which are very lethal, but not very contagious. There's some like COVID, which is very contagious, like Omicron, very contagious, but not very lethal. I mean, it's killing a lot of people, but not terribly lethal. Suppose one comes along that's both contagious and lethal. Could happen. Could be happening right now with avian flu. The virologists don't know. There are likely to be others. They could be much more serious. It's criminal that resources are not being poured into this. I mean, scientists have some idea about how to prevent it. It could be universal vaccines. It's not inconceivable. Very little research. No government money going into it. The money is going into destruction. If somebody's watching this from outer space, they think we're insane.
간단하게 말씀하시네요. 촘스키 교수께서는 뭐 사실 중국의 그 13억 인구가 주는 거대 시장을 한국을 예로 들면서 지금은 뭐 단기적으로는 미국이 주도하는 데 참여할 수밖에 없고 또 적극적으로 참여하는 것처럼 보이지만은 그러나 중국이라는 거대 시장의 매력을 어느 나라인들 쉽게 포기할 수 있겠는가? 뭐 현실적인 논리죠.
시간은 중국의 편일 것이다.
뭐 그런 말로 의역할 수 있죠.
시간은 중국의 편일 것이다. 근데 교수님, 지금까지 하신 말씀을 제가 쭉 듣고 있으니까 전반적으로 교수님께서는 미국에 대해서는 좀 비판적이고, 그리고 푸틴에 대해서는 다른 사람들이 보는 시각에 비해서는 좀 긍정적으로 보시는 것 같습니다. 그럼 개인적으로 보시기에 푸틴이라는 정치인, 푸틴이라는 리더는 어떻게 평가하십니까?
He's a harsh, brutal autocrat. He's a kleptomaniac. He's gotten to be super rich himself and his clique around him. I don't want to have dinner with him. He's not my friend. But he's not Peter the Great. He's not trying to conquer the world. They've got narrow interests, which can be accommodated, I think. Can't know unless you try. But there should be ways to bring about an accommodation, a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic settlement in the Ukraine conflict that'll keep it from escalating, destroying Ukraine with all the side damage it's causing, and to move towards allowing the integration of Europe, Western Europe, and the rest of Eurasia into something like what Gorbachev depicted, a common European home with no military alliances and expansion of the natural commercial trade relations between resource-rich Russia, technology, industrial-rich Western Germany. They need each other, and it should be possible to reconstruct that. I should say that the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, almost certainly by the US, was another step towards breaking this relation. In fact, an act of war, if you look at it. But it's interesting. It's not discussed in the United States. You can't talk about it. But it's not a joke. It's another step towards breaking what should be a natural relationship. The idea of NATO expanding over the entire world to the Indo-Pacific region, that should be intolerable. South Korea should not go along with this, nor should Japan.
저녁을 같이 결코 먹고 싶지 않을 만큼 우리 비판적 지식인, 미국의 비판적 지식인이라고 해서 푸틴의 정치적인 캐릭터 자체를 높이 평가하는 게 아니고 객관적인 팩트는 팩트대로 인정을 하고 그러나 그 푸틴의 리더로서의 푸틴을 평가하는 것도 냉혹하게 아주 직설적으로
오늘 뭐 러시아 이야기, 우크라이나 이야기는 여기까지 좀 하고요. 화제를 좀 바꿔서 교수님이 보시는 세계 경제에 대한 질문을 좀 간단하게 들어보려고 합니다. 그냥 막연한 질문을 드려보죠. 세계 경제는 앞으로 어떻게 흘러갈 걸로 보십니까?
One possibility, a narrow possibility, is a move back towards the regulated economy of the early post-war years. I don't think that was wonderful by any means, but it was the fastest growth period in Western economic history. For the United States, it's called the Golden Decade. In France, in Europe, it's the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. That was a form of basically pretty much regulated capitalism. Finance was under control. There were no great financial crises. In the United States, the Treasury Department kept a firm hand on finance. Take a look at the statistics. It's shocking. I mean, in the United States, until through the 50s and the 60s, the great growth period, real wages, tracked productivity Take a look at the chart. Breaks in the late 70s. Productivity goes up, real wages stagnate and decline. It's the same on just about every other measure. Health costs were pretty much normal for Western countries till the late 70s. Start going up. Health outcomes go down. Just about every measure breaks. As I said, the estimate of transfer of resources is about $50 trillion. It's not even the top 1%. Most of it goes to a fraction of the top 1%. It's just about every measure you look, that's what you see. Neoliberalism, the rhetoric says free markets. That's a pure lie. It's not free markets. Take a look at the World Trade Organization. It's highly protectionist, has protectionist measures that go way beyond anything in the past. That's why Pfizer and Moderna just announced that they're going to raise the prices of vaccines. It costs them about $3 to produce a vaccine. They're going to charge $130. How can they do that? Because of protectionism, because of radical opposition to free trade on the part of Clinton and everyone else who set up this rules-based economy. Take deregulation. As soon as deregulation started, crises started. But there's a little footnote to that. It's not deregulation. It's deregulation plus bailout. That's neoliberalism. Deregulate, make a ton of money, crisis, we bail you out. That's case after case each time. Go through the details if we had time. It's a fraud. It's no free market. It's a powerful state intervening to protect the rich and the corporate sector with great success. As they say, $50 trillion is not a joke. It's happened similarly in other countries. Most of the workforce is living precarious lives. Real wages are barely moved. For male non-supervisory workers, it's about what it was in 1979. Been plenty of economic growth, only to very few pockets. So is there an alternative to that? Well, a narrow alternative is what preceded, but you can go way beyond that. Why shouldn't working people take control of production, for example? They can, certainly can. In fact, they have tried to do so. But then you move towards economic democracy. That's also a possibility. And there are many options ahead. If we break the straitjacket of thinking things have to be this way, they don't by any means.
우리 그 촘스키 교수가 이코노미스트나
예.
아니면 경제사학자가 아니기 때문에 그러나 이제 그 철학과 언어를 한 철학자로서 그리고 비판적 지식인으로서 보기에 현재 여러 가지 갈등, 그러니까 각국이 안고 있는 갈등과 문제점을 봤을 때의 자유방임, 그러니까 신자유주의 시대는 끝난 것 같고 규제가 한층 강화되는 경제로 흘러갈 수밖에 없는 상황이지 않는가. 이것은 규제 경제가 좋다는 의미는 아니신 것 같고요.
그런데 그 시절에 규제가 강했을 때 경제가 오히려 빠르게 잘 성장했다고 설명하시는 것 같은데요.
그렇죠. 그러니까 이제 우리가 학자들, 특히 그 철학을 전공한 사람들의 언어를 이해를 할 때에 저걸 지지해서 하는 말인가, 아니면은 있는 현실을 그냥 그대로 묘사하는 말인가.
예.
그걸 좀 고민을 해본다라면 이 묘사 쪽인 것 같습니다. 사실은. 예.
그렇게 되어 가고 있는 것 같이 내 눈에도 보인다.
예. 자, 교수님 조금은 그 실존적인 질문을 좀 하나 마지막으로 던지고 싶습니다. 그 교수님 그 90년을 정말 그 어떤 뭐랄까 날카롭게 현실을 비판하고 특히 세계 패권국가 미국의 외교 정책, 그 다음에 미국 내의 어떤 경제 정책을 비판을 해오셨는데, 그런데 주류 미디어, 미국의 주류 미디어는 그다지 그 교수님의 말씀을 주목하지 않고 있는 게 현실입니다. 참 외로움을 좀 느끼실 수도 있을 것 같은데 어떠신지요?
I'm very deeply embedded in the popular movements in the United States. That's my interest. I don't care about the elite media. They don't care about me. I don't care about them. So perfectly happy to talk to them if they want to, but it's not antagonism. We just live in different worlds.
뭐 하루 이틀이냐?
그러나 자기 주변에는 제 뜻을 같이 하는 시민운동하는 사람들
예.
그리고 뜻을 같이 하는 사람과 강한 유대를 갖고 있기 때문에 외로움을 느끼지 않는다. 단 참 재미난 표현인데 이제 영어식 표현을 한다면 일리트 미디어, 그러니까 주류 미디어, 엘리트 미디어라고 그러죠. 엘리트 미디어와 자기는 전혀 다른 세상에 살고 있는 존재다. 그렇다고 해서 그들에 대해서는 적대감을 갖고 있는 게 아니고 서로 다른 세계에 머물고 있다라고 말씀을 하시네요.
네, 교수님 인터뷰에 응해주셔서 고맙습니다.
Very pleased to be with you. Thank you.
어떻게 보셨습니까?
자,
저는 참 그 우리 촘스키 교수의 그 인터뷰 저는 사실 진행하면서 좀 약간 사실 행복합니다.
왜요?
지지해서가 아니고 아까도 이제 제 책도 그렇습니다만은 그 가끔은 재테크 어디 가서 돈을 얼마나 벌 수 있을까? 어떤 재테크 굉장히 소중하고 중요한 정보입니다만은 가끔은 좀 철학적이고 싶을 때가 있거든요.
그럼요. 나와는 다른 생각을 가진 사람의 이야기를 들으면서 뭔가 또 배워가면서 그러나 또 나의 가치관을 강화하게 되는 그 묘한
그렇죠.
그 지적 스릴이 여러분이 즐기고 계시는 현재 글로벌 머니톡의 엔터테인먼트의 본질이 아닌가 하는 생각이 듭니다.
지금까지 글로벌 머니토크의 경제나 투자자들뿐만 아니라 전염병 학자, 그 다음에 행복이란 무엇인가, 행복의 역사, 행복이라는 개념이 우리 머릿속에서 3,000년 동안 어떻게 진화해 왔는가. 지금은 패권국 미국에 대해서 미국에 살고 있으면서도 끊임없이 비판하고, 그러니까 비판적 지식인이라 그러죠.
예.
무슨 쉽게 말하면 뭐 한 사회의 맥이, 한 그룹 내의 맥이 내지는 소금과 같은 존재. 그래서 총체적으로 미국의 존재의 능력을 강화시켜주는 결과적으로는 참 부럽죠, 그런 부분이.
그렇죠.
예.
예.
그래서 한번 그런 석학이란 단어가 과장법이 아니고 적절하게 쓰일 수 있는 존재, 그런 분을 인터뷰했습니다.
네. 자, 다음 인터뷰도 저희가 또 기대를 갖고
그렇죠.
기다리기만 하면 되죠?
예.
네. 글로벌 머니톡의 시청자들은 참 그냥 기다리기만 하면 되고 또 오면 그냥 보기만 하면 되고 좋으시겠습니다.
우리 다음 인터뷰는 사실 이웃이죠.
이웃?
네, 이웃 일본의 일본은행의 수장이 바뀝니다. 그 수장이, 새로운 수장이 일본은행 총재가 앞으로 어떤 통화 정책을 펼쳐나갈지에 대해서 그 미국도 아니고 중국도 아니고 한국도 아닌 일본인의 시각에서 한번 설명을 들어보죠. 그래서 일본의 이코노미스트를 섭외해놓고 있습니다.
한일 관계 변화가 있는 미묘한 시점에
그렇죠.
네, 또 미묘한 인터뷰가 진행되겠군요.
예.
예. 하여튼 뭐 여러분들은 그냥 계속 즐기시만 하시고 남는 시간 있으시면 뭐 이런 책도 좀 가끔씩 읽어보시고 하면 좋겠습니다. 아이고 이 녀석아 이 녀석아 가만히 서 있어야지. 그렇지. 자, 글로벌 머니톡 여기서 마무리하겠습니다.
감사합니다.